Hey there, Bear Club! At the Mama Bear Initiative, we explore how to protect ourselves so we can protect our cubs, the people who depend on us. Join us and get the confidence you need to stay safe, make good choices, and protect yourself and those you care about. Let's go!
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Mama Bear Initiative podcast. My name is Stephanie Dunham.
I'm Evelyn Mason.
I'm Rochelle Knapp.
Yeah, so we are back here in our little tiny studio, I guess you could call it, getting ready to talk about something really important that I really wish more people would do in general, just because it doesn't seem to be that common of a thing. Although whenever you go to any advice columnists or Dr. John Deloney or any of those things, any of those people, they're often, promoting this particular topic, and that is confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of it, reasons people don't do it, reasons why you should, and finally, how. Because the how part, I think, is what trips people up.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Most people don't want to, but then even if they do want to, they're just not quite sure how to do it.
Right.
Because there is a way to go about it that produces something. Because confrontation shouldn't just be about telling the other person off and that you don't like what they're doing. It should be about solving a problem. So, all right, let's get started. So we're going to start with reasons people don't want to or don't confront people. And when we say confront, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so basically it's addressing a problem, something we see that isn't right. Maybe there's a pattern of behavior or just, something's off that needs to be talked about.
Right. And oftentimes it's something somebody's doing. It could be something they're doing to you, something they're doing to other people, or something they're doing to themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
It's usually something that's harmful in some way, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah. So confrontation isn't, I want to say this up front. Confrontation, like I said, isn't about telling the other person off or telling them how they're wrong necessarily. There has to be a reason. There has to be a goal in mind. And, there has to be a benefit to what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we want to make things better.
Right. You want to make something better. And, like I'm married. I've been married for 22 years now. I hope if my husband listens to this, I hope I got that right. Out of the two of us, he's the one that remembers.
You got married in 2002, right?
Yeah.
So we're looking at 22 years.
Okay.
Good mathing.
Thanks. I don't know if it's mathing or memorizing, but here we are.
Here we are.
So when I got married, I think when people are in love, initially the romantic stage, you're just kind of overlooking things that the other person's doing. It's after you've been married for a while that things kind of like tend to become noticeable.
Right.
Yeah.
And stuff you may have ignored when you were dating and engaged now becomes real.
Yeah.
And it's in your face all the time.
Yeah.
Because typically people who are married live together.
Right.
What?
You're sharing a space that creates, in and of itself, creates tension.
Right.
And a lot of marriages end because people were unwilling to confront the other person about whatever it was that they're bothered by.
Right.
And it really doesn't matter whether the thing you're bothered by is legitimate or not. The fact is it bothered you.
Right.
Yeah.
But, a lot of people just don't bother for lots of different reasons. So what's one of the major reasons why people don't confront?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is passivity. I'm someone who's well experienced with passivity, who's learning to overcome that. And it's easier to not say anything. It's easier to just in the short term. It's easier to just let it go.
Well, yeah, especially if you grew up in a situation like where you did speak up, you did try to say something and you get shut down. After a while, you're like, I'm just not going to say anything.
Right.
It's safer to just be quiet and to just let it happen.
Yeah. Rochelle, what is passivity? What do you mean by that?
It means essentially what it boils down to is accepting someone's bad behavior, whatever that is. And the thing that they're doing that's bothering you just continues on. You don't say anything to them about it. You just sort of accept it as reality instead of confronting them and asking them or trying to resolve a problem or speak about how you feel about it.
Yeah. So it's like, there's somebody who's poking you in the eye and you're just letting them.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
You're not saying stop it. You're not saying this is hurting me. You're not doing anything about it. You're just letting them do it.
Right.
So basically, you're just choosing to not address it.
Right. Being passive. No. What are reasons that people are passive about it?
Mostly fear.
Fear of what?
Rejection of things escalating to turning into like a really bad argument or something like that. Essentially just not getting anywhere with confronting someone if they're volatile.
Yeah. I was thinking about the volatility aspect. If you get yelled at or even somebody, lifted up their hand or even struck you in the past, you don't want that to happen again. You're so afraid. It's basically a fear of something bad will happen if I address this.
Right.
And so that fear outweighs the need, the least perceived need to step up and say, this isn't right, or, however you address it.
Yeah. I think another reason people are passive about other people's behavior is fear of losing something.
Right.
Could be the relationship.
Yeah.
Could be a resource. It could be a number of things that, if I confront this person about their behavior, then I'll be cut off from something that you value from that person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So in some people's minds, accepting other people's behavior comes with some kind of a resource that they feel they need.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And to be honest with you, that's kind of a really bad thing to allow.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there are ways out of things. There are other resources. But I feel like sometimes we limit ourselves to believing that only this person can give me what I want,
Right.
or feel I need. Let's say, I don't know, one of the more typical situations is a stay-at-home mom whose husband is abusive,
Yeah.
right? And there's a variety of reasons why women stay in those situations, but a lot of times it's because they don't have, or they believe they couldn't provide for themselves and their children.
Right.
And if the husband's doing all the providing, right, it's scary to think if I leave this person, then I'll have to find a job, or I could be homeless, or, there's any number of things.
Right.
Right.
And so they just become passive and just accept whatever's being handed to them
Yeah.
without ever thinking through the consequences of what's happening to them,
Yeah.
which oftentimes is death,
Yeah.
or even if they survive the situation, their children grow up accepting it or becoming it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
I think the idea of passivity too is it can get into your system little by little, where you get conditioned over the years. Anytime I pop my head up, it gets slammed down.
Mm-hmm.
So it hasn't worked in the past. So
Right.
I'm afraid now. And I think a lot of times it's like the that reaction of fear of freezing.
Mm-hmm. Passivity is a kind of freezing and fawning.
It's
to be honest.
Protect as a poor coping mechanism.
Right. And, I'm not saying that there's something bad about a woman who's in a situation like this. I'm not saying they're bad.
Right.
I'm just talking about why women tend to, or even anybody in an abusive relationship, tell themselves or become to try to survive, and the reasons why they become passive, it's a kind of protection
Right.
for the situation, but that problem eventually escalates to a point where somebody's life is at risk or something bad's going to happen to the children or whatever.
Yeah,
Right.
because the fact of the matter is, the passivity is not helping a situation that is getting worse and worse and worse.
Right. And there's some hope that the person will change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if we think about addicts, drug addicts, alcoholics, I think people tend to hope that the loved one in their life will just suddenly get an epiphany one day and decide not to be a drug addict or decide not to be an alcoholic. And that does happen.
It does. But
Yeah.
But oftentimes it takes some intervention.
Or some very drastic situation that
Right.
forces them.
yeah, I used to watch. I watched the Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew, and another one called, I can't remember what it was called now. It was another similar show, but they weren't celebrities, and I think it's called Intervention.
Oh, yeah. I've
And
seen a couple of episodes of that.
It was always this sort of pattern of, not all the time, but the majority of the time, the addict rejected everybody's input. They basically said, I don't care. I want what I want. And basically the addict in them was talking about getting their next fix. And that's all they really cared about.
Right.
And it did take a very drastic life and death situation, if they were going to change it all, for them to actually take it seriously and go to rehab and get the help they needed. Unfortunately, now I think the statistic is 2% of people stay sober after 2 years. It's a very small percentage of people who go to rehab. They refuse to continue on in their recovery.
Right. So I guess what we're saying is there's also sort of a nihilistic, well, it's not going to make a difference if I speak up point of view
Yeah.
Right.
to a person because I've tried and they won't listen to me, or other people have spoken up and they didn't listen to them. You know, that could be a reason why people would say, I'm not going to bother. And I think sometimes that's legitimate,
Yeah.
but it's not legitimate from the beginning. Maybe if you've tried a few times,
Right.
maybe you could get there and that would be a legitimate point of view. But from the get-go, I'm not sure that that's
Yeah.
reasonable.
Yeah. And I think that segues pretty nicely into the idea of hoping that someone else will speak up. Sometimes someone else does need to speak up because, if you've ever experienced where you're trying to tell your kid something and you're trying to get this message across, and then he hears it from somebody else's mom or somewhere else, and now he's got it. You're like, why weren't you listening to me? Okay, well, I'm just glad you've got it. But sometimes, that whole idea of not my monkey, not my circus, unless it is my monkey, it is my circus, I'm the one who needs to speak up.
Right.
But sometimes you just hope, somebody else, maybe somebody else will handle it.
Yeah. Or, maybe you're feeling that fear of rejection or the fear of escalation, or maybe not qualified to speak on the problem
Yeah.
because it's not your kid or not your spouse or whatever. But I don't know. I just don't accept those reasons for not speaking up. I feel like,
Right.
of course, there's probably going to be something that happens. I mean, every time you're trying to here's something about trying to do the right thing
Yeah.
that people need to know. I'd say the chances of bad things happening because you're doing the right thing are pretty high.
Right.
Yeah.
Rejection will probably happen. Escalation will probably happen. That doesn't mean that you don't do the right thing.
Right.
Yeah. And sometimes the initial response seems really negative and really bad. But then over time, you realize, that needed to happen. And even though people were really upset, we're at a better place now because I did speak up.
Right. So, as far as reasons people don't confront other people. We've talked about passivity. We've talked about fear of rejection. We've talked about fear of escalation. Now, well, let's talk about that for just a minute. Like a fear of escalation, what does that even mean? Like, what is there to fear?
I mean, it's already bad. I don't want to make it worse.
Don't want to make it worse. What else?
If the person's violent, if they're abusive, they could very easily get triggered and be abusive again.
Right.
Or even worse than before.
They could leave.
Right.
You know, like if it's somebody if you're married to them or they're living with you or whatever, if I confront them about this problem, they might leave me.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and that goes back to that whole resource thing. You know, I've never lived with anyone. Well, that's not actually true. I did live with my first husband for a short period of time before we got married. And I didn't work during the last part of my pregnancy. I think I worked for some period of time, but then after I got to a certain point, I didn't work because I was heavily pregnant. And I really didn't want to.
Yeah.
I was 19 at the time, didn't know much about the world. And I just didn't want to work. I wanted to stay home and be pregnant. And, you know, we weren't married at the time, but, you know, there were things that he was doing that bothered me. Mm-hmm. But I felt at the time that if I spoke up, that he would push me out because it was his house I was living in, not mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I had left my family home and cut everybody off. So I really didn't have a place to go.
Right.
I wasn't in any groups of any kind. I wasn't in a church. There was nothing for me. So confronting him on some of the things he was doing would have left me out in the cold, heavily pregnant.
Yeah.
Right? With no food, shelter, water, whatever. And when you're that pregnant, the last thing you want to be is homeless.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So putting up with his crap was my only option.
Yeah. I think I kept thinking that feeling trapped. Like, I have to put up with this because I really don't have any other options.
Yeah.
Even if you do.
He had proven himself to be fairly scary by that point. It wasn't necessarily directed at me, but he said some things and did some things that indicated to me that he could become violent.
Yeah.
And at the time, it felt like protection for me instead of violence against me.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But there was still an element of, well, if I say something, he could get violent.
Right.
He could yell at me, you know, or he could push me out or do a number of things and I could be in trouble.
Yeah. And even the things you tell yourself, you know, justification just so you can feel safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we talked about, like, you know, people reacting to things that you said in a prior episode. It's not a reason not to.
Right.
Right.
You know, but when people would start yelling at you and start threatening you, it gets scary fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Right. And,
yeah.
you know, if someone's bigger and stronger than you and they're like screaming at you, that can really make it so that you don't want to bother.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely.
It's intimidating, terrifying.
Right. Which is a reason why women in general should have some sort of fight training.
Yeah.
I'm plugging for self-defense training for you ladies.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Or martial arts training.
Yep.
Get out there and do something.
Yeah.
Fathers, brothers, teach your daughters.
Yes. Teach them how to
Yes.
fight. So important.
Yeah. So they can say no without fear.
And also teach them what healthy looks like. Healthy relationship.
Yeah.
Genuinely protective, genuinely caring. And what abuse is, because it's not those things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if there were more confrontations in marriage, there might be less divorce.
Yeah.
That's true.
Instead of
saying.
letting resentment build.
Right. Which
Let's-
is a good
yeah.
reason to do it. So let's move to reasons to confront. But before we do that, we want to ask you to consider sharing this podcast episode with someone that you care about. Take a moment, copy the link out of whatever platform you're listening to this on, text it to a friend, a loved one, a family member, whatever, so that they could get the benefits of what we're saying here. And, you know, we want to spread our message around. And the best way to do that is for people who are listening to share.
Yep.
So if you would do that, we would be really grateful and appreciate your support. All right. Moving on. Reasons to confront. So we've talked about a few already in the context of reasons people don't.
Right.
But the most basic reason why you need to bring something up is seeing, knowing, or feeling something is not right.
Yeah.
So what do we mean by that, Evelyn?
So it's just, I think it starts with sort of a gut feeling a lot of times, like, just something, it just feels off. Something's off. And then kind of stepping back and going, all right, what's going on here? You know, what's going on, what should be going on.
Right.
And, you know, where's the disconnect?
Right. Yeah. So, you know, gut feelings are one thing. Noticing patterns in something is, you know, this is maybe or maybe not about a one-time encounter with someone. This is more about ongoing relationships.
Yeah, because really sometimes things are one-off. And it's not a pattern. But if you keep seeing it happening and you know it's not right, you just know it. You know, you feel like, all right, you know, something needs to change here.
Yeah. Now, there are times when confronting a stranger in a public place who's doing something that shouldn't be happening is okay.
Right.
Like, if you see some guy screaming at his girlfriend and you happen to be there, stepping in and asking the girlfriend, can I help you? Would you like to leave with me? Would you like to use my phone to call the cops? You know, that's a good thing to do. And you can even say, you need to stop screaming at her.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's okay to do. Now, again, people often don't get involved because of fear of escalation, fear of getting hurt, that kind of thing. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't say something, because if you care about other people enough,
Right.
we're not asking you to fall in love with this or form a lifelong friendship with some
Right.
stranger's girlfriend in the middle of a restaurant, but that person's being treated badly
Right.
Right.
in front of you.
Yeah, and I think realizing, too, that it's not something I'm watching on TV. This is really happening to real people in the real world, and I'm here,
Right.
and I can do something about it.
Right. Right. But I think what we're advocating for is mainly about long-term relationships.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the need for confrontation and conversation and resolution is very strong in our society. There's not enough of it going on.
Right. Definitely not.
Yeah, and we really are suffering as a result.
Right. Divorce rates, abuse, children growing up with certain beliefs without ever knowing what's real or what's true.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of reasons why. So, you know, just knowing that something isn't right isn't quite enough.
Right.
There's also the element of something needs to change. That things can't go on as is. Rochelle, you want to talk about that?
Yeah. I think for me, I see a lot of bad behaviors in the world, but they're not people I would confront. They're not people I know. Unless it escalates to a certain point, I might step in and say something. But in terms of ongoing relationships, if something somebody is doing is bothering you and it's continuing on, you should definitely say something to them.
Like, explain what you mean by bothering you. What does that look like?
Well, for an example from my own life, as my sister recently brought something up to me about not caring about people's property enough to pay attention to what I'm doing with it. And I received that message yesterday and previously. And I'm in a place now in my life where I want to know when I need to change. And that's the other side of this conversation, kind of. And it's important to point those things out because the person's behavior could be at the worst destructive, physically destructive, and then somewhere about hurting someone's feelings, hurting your feelings, harming someone else in some other way. I lost my drink. And just basically like trying to get them to stop doing what they're doing that's bothering you in a nice way. In as nice a way as you can do it. But making your points and saying, these are the reasons why it's bothering me, making it clear to them and asking them to change their behavior or stop doing what they're doing.
Right. So you're talking about it from the perspective of the person being confronted.
Right.
So let's talk about it from the perspective of the person who needs to do the confrontation. So if we're going to use this example that you're talking about, from my perspective, I have some things that were broken over time that I no longer have, right? Mm-hmm. Because of, whatever. And if you take each item individually, in the grand scheme of things, a broken platter, for example, isn't that great of a loss, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So if Rochelle broke a platter, whatever, it can be replaced. But when it becomes a regular thing, one by one, I'm losing resources.
Yeah.
I'm losing property, right? So that means that I either need to be okay with the property loss, or I need to say something to you about what's happening and find out why it's happening and bring up some kind of possible resolution to the problem.
Right.
So that the property loss will hopefully slow down or stop.
Yeah.
Right.
And it really benefits all parties.
Right.
Because the person who is continuing to do the thing that's harmful, they need to change their behavior. And what if no one speaks up, And then, of course, you want to have your,
I want to have my things.
Yeah. And you want to be respected, too. And that understanding of this is harmful and it needs to stop.
Right. And, breaking a platter and a few other things is one thing. But when you have somebody repeatedly treating you a certain way, talking to you a certain way, like with anger, for example, that is more meaningful in the long run than losing a few dishes. Right? Because this becomes about your own personal integrity.
Right.
And about how you feel about yourself, because someone constantly talking to you with anger has an effect on you.
Right.
It can cause you problems. It isn't just their problem, it also causes you problems.
Right. And I think the idea that you care enough to confront the person about it. I was thinking about how the person might realize, I know, like they'll do something and then they feel bad afterwards. But they know that there's a pattern, or maybe there's at least some awareness. Mm-hmm. But when somebody actually takes the time to say, this is what you're doing. And you're like, yeah, I know. This is how it's hurting me. Oh, yeah. Now, how can we resolve this? Now I feel like if I'm the one on the receiving end of that, somebody cares enough and maybe I can get out of this cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you're trying to create a boundary, but also keep the person in your life.
Right.
You're not trying to just reject them altogether. You're trying to resolve it so you can maintain your connection.
Yeah. And that you care enough instead of just going, forget this, I'm done. Now, there is a place for that after you've tried with the person, after you've confronted, after you've, and maybe they've given promises, but they keep failing, or there's that they won't even address it, refuse to. Mm-hmm. But in so many cases, it's worth it. It's worth fighting for. So let's talk about it. Let's figure this out together.
Yeah, I think the worth fighting for is the main reason this relationship is worth fighting for, is the main reason that people should be willing to confront other people about stuff that they're doing.
Right.
So we've gone about half an hour on this topic, but we have more to discuss. So we're going to do a part 2. So I want to thank you for joining us today for part 1 of Confrontation, and welcome you to come back and listen to part 2.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks so much for joining us as we discuss such an important topic. We hope you got some food for thought and encouragement to keep going and keep growing. See you later, Bear Club.
Remember to join the Bear Club on our Patreon page for exclusive content. The link is in the description. You can find our podcast on Google, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.